I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I'm speaking today with Mark McCandlish, Aerospace Illustrator and UFO Propulsion Specialist. Well, to start right out, Peter Jennings ran a special report last week on UFOs entitled Seeing is Believing. This report documented many aspects of the UFO phenomena, but had a suspicious absence of any speculation on how these things actually work. Now, 2 days before the report aired, I'd asked Dr. Ted Loder who the real experts on reverse engineering this technology are. He gave me one name, Mark McCandlish. Mark's joining us to talk a bit about his background in this area, as well as discuss some of the technologies that the Jennings report just plain missed. Well, Mark, you've had a successful career as an aerospace illustrator, designer, and conceptual artist, and you initially became involved with reverse engineering of UFO technology after a colleague described several unusual aircraft he'd seen in a hangar at Norton Air Force Base near San Bernardino, California. Now, the description is he'd seen three craft that were witnessed as being flying saucers hovering above the floor without any means of visible support. What exactly did he see, and why did he share this information with you?
Well, there were actually more than just the three flying saucers. In fact, that was kind of the big finale for this display that was originally part of an exhibit that was put on in a very large hangar at Norton Air Force Base on November 12, 1988, under the cover of an air show. There were a variety of somewhat exotic hovercraft. There was the losing competing or competitor prototype in the B-2 stealth bomber competition, which was a strange looking flying wing design that had the same sort of faceted surfaces of the F-117A stealth fighter that was from the losing competitive team of Rockwell and Lockheed Martin. As you know, Northrop got the contract for the B-2 stealth bomber. And then there were a couple of short takeoff and landing type aircraft that used some exotic wing configurations that looked like Venetian blinds tied together at the ends with kind of a fence and a main landing gear at the lower trailing edge with kind of an engine nacelle mounted just above and forward of this Venetian blind arrangement on each side of the fuselage that would actually reshape the exhaust flow coming out of the engine and sort of like flattening out the kind of funnel that you would use to put oil into your car engine with, so that the exhaust was sort of streaming across the entire leading edge of the wings, allowing it to use the Coanda effect, that is the sort of the adhesion of the airstream to the top of the wings, and redirect it into a nearly vertical downward thrust for takeoff. And then once it got completely airborne, the individual wings, I think there were up to 5 of them, would go horizontal, and it could fly forward like a normal plane.
Sure.
Pretty ingenious idea. Sounds like something that Burt Rutan might come up with. But anyway, at some point during the exhibit that Brad had been escorted into by a client of his, he was given an opportunity to see 3 different of these vehicles employing a kind of anti-gravity propulsion system. He indicated that there were no cables or any other kind of suspension devices holding them up off the floor, and no landing gear underneath, and yet they were there, a foot or 2 off the floor without really making any kind of noise. There was a cutaway illustration next to the smallest of the 3 vehicles. The smallest one being about 24 feet in diameter. The next size up was about 60 feet, and then the largest was between 120 and 130 feet in diameter. And they all pretty much had the same proportions, flat on the bottom, sloping sides, a slight ledge at the midpoint, and then the upper half of a sphere, which was actually a complete ball, both inside and out, that comprised the crew compartment.
So these are actually pretty traditional in terms of the way we think of UFOs, right?
Well, they would be in the sense that, if you went back through our own history of ufology, you would say that these vehicles look like your classic late 50s, 1960s type of flying saucer. And in fact, if you took the propulsion system components and superimposed them over just about any flying saucer design photographed between, say, 1945 and the present day, you could pretty much fit the components into any one of those designs. So it's kind of like the basic design for an American automobile. You have 4 tires, a steering wheel, an engine, transmission, differential, whatever it is. And even when you mix these components up and place them in different ways, you still wind up with the same basic configuration that makes the thing go. And having been an automotive design student when I was at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, and being a car nut, taking things apart and putting them back together has always been kind of a hobby of mine. So when I heard this story from this former college associate of mine, I was intrigued enough to wanted to go and investigate more of what makes these things work.
Well, in terms of the actual propulsion system, one of the things that I haven't been totally clear about understanding, and I should apologize for this, I should let the audience know that your story is well documented in the Disclosure Project, which was initially put together by Stephen Greer, and Ted Loder has participated to some degree in that.
Yes,
but in the brief context of our interview, how did he happen to find out about how this thing worked? Was the schematic showing the cutaway of it detailed enough for him to really pick up the tips on how it worked?
Well, that was what he said. He indicated that there was an easel next to the smallest of the 3 vehicles, the 24-foot diameter version. He said that they had a number of the composite panels on the sloping sides of the fuselage removed so that you could see inside. The diagram, this cutaway illustration that was on this easel, turns out to be remarkably similar to the cutaway illustration that I produced from the elements that this individual described to me in a number of interviews that I did in the weeks and months following this event on the 12th of November, 1988.
So your work then really started in trying to understand this vehicle and what your colleague was describing, but it's evolved from then to include your own research, right? You've kind of taken it farther than that. You started out with kind of a specific set of ideas from what he described, and you've moved farther out to try and really reverse engineer this stuff.
Well, I really did. I mean, it appeared from what I could see that this device was, although the physics that it employed to make itself operate is probably very sophisticated, the actual components are really remarkably simple. That is to say that it would appear to consist of an exceptionally large Tesla coil with a very large diameter primary windings at the midpoint, which actually is what makes up part of the ledge that's right below the crew compartment sphere when you're looking at the external dimensions of the vehicle. And then up through the central section of the sphere is a column. And I believe that that column actually employs a portion of the secondary windings of the Tesla coil. Now, there is an array of plate capacitors that pretty much take up the entire ventral or bottom surface of the vehicle. Imagine a very large, very thick pizza pie with 48 slices, very thin isosceles triangles, all sort of pointing inward or terminating at the very center of the disc, which makes up the bottom of the vehicle. And this is, sort of the basic layout of the component or components in the vehicle. But the proportion, the size, the placement, the orientation of one component to the other is really at the heart of what makes the system work, in my view. And so what I did was I began looking for patents and research and different types of scientific papers that might explain why these things work in such an unusual way, what it is that causes this propulsion system to have the capabilities that it does.
Well, one of the things that we've been trying to solve with the lifters is some issues with the inertia when they take off and fly. They just don't seem to fly entirely like they should unless inertia is being modified. And, one of the things that's interesting is you're describing the B-field-Brown effect on this craft. And offhand, I would look at that and say, I don't see how the power is there for the thrust. But you're also describing another mechanism that would radically enhance the B-field-Brown effect. And in this case, that seems to be a mass nullification or anti-gravity effect from some kind of a mercury vapor plasma that it uses, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really what's going on at the very core of the vehicle. The central column, although it does seem to employ the secondary windings of the Tesla coil, I think that there are dual functions in some of these components, namely that you have the primary and secondary windings of this, what would ordinarily be referred to as an open-air transformer system, kind of like a Tesla coil, that takes a relatively small voltage and kicks it up to thousands and thousands of volts. That voltage is rectified and stored in the capacitor sections, and then by controlling the amount of electricity that goes to each one of the capacitor plate stacks in these 48 different sections, you can then control the yaw and the pitch, more or less shaping the field that's around the vehicle through the B-field-Brown effect. But as you say, I don't think the B-field-Brown effect by itself is responsible for ultimately achieving this mass nullification or the so-called anti-gravity or electrogravitic effect that allows for tremendous accelerations from a standing stop or making things like right-angle turns at well over 5,000 miles an hour possible. Now, having witnessed these things, I mean, it sounds just incomprehensible when you first talk about it if you have any familiarity with the physics we're familiar with today. But having seen these types of episodes directly with my own eyes on multiple occasions, it just occurred to me that there had to be something else going on. And that was really sort of the focus of the research that I did.
Well, one of the core aspects of the modern UFO story is the performance of these craft, which far outstrips anything we can visualize, even in terms of electromagnetic thrust. The lifter technology, if you scaled it up large enough, you gave it enough electricity, it was a large enough area, it could, in fact, probably perform better than an aircraft. We did UV experiments to demonstrate that. However, it doesn't look like you could do the kind of performance with it that you would get from the UFOs that people are seeing. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is that implies that there's an inertial nullification going on. And that also suggests that once you nullify inertia, so that you literally don't crush the occupants of the craft when you pull a hairpin, going at Mach 10 or something, once you nullify that inertial effect, then you can use a much smaller propulsion system to make it move and a very small amount of energy for, yaw and pitch control.
Well, that's true. One of the things that I think is often overlooked by propulsion engineers is that mass, as it's used in the physics literature, is an effect. It is not a quantity per se. It's not like a barbell that weighs 10 or 20 pounds. It is not a physical attribute. It is an effect. And it is an effect that is linked directly to the interaction of the atomic structure of any given thing in our universe with something that or that is referred to in the physics literature as quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum. Now, this term zero-point energy or these zero-point fluctuations originally got their name from the fact that this sort of pervasive and random electrical flux or electrical charge that seems to be present in space-time is there even when taken down to nearly absolute zero temperature. That is to say, when you remove all other types of heat energy from the environment, which is responsible for the movement of molecules and atoms and stuff through what is called Brownian motion. You still have this residual electrical charge down near zero, absolute zero temperature. And so that is kind of where it got the name zero-point energy. It's this energy that is still there. And so there's been a lot of speculation about where does this energy come from, what is its purpose, what does it do. And I think probably one of the landmark papers that kind of helped to show the link between mass inertia and atomic structure was a paper that was written somewhere in the late 1980s, early 1990s by Hal Puthoff that related to the stability of the hydrogen atom and its direct link to the interaction with this zero-point energy. Now, the way I try to visualize it, because I'm not someone who sits around doing equations all day. I'm an artist and a designer, so I try to visualize it in the following way. Think of it as having the image before you of the hydrogen atom with a proton and one electron spinning, and having a very low mass rating in terms of its position on the periodic table. And then you set that down next to an atom of uranium-235 with 235 protons, 235 neutrons, and 235 electrons. And, all in various places, in the nucleus or in the electron shells around the outside of the atom. And if you compare the two of those things, the hydrogen and the uranium, you begin to see that just by virtue of the fact that the one element has considerably more components that are all spinning and in motion. Spinning in motion, by the way, that never stops, seems to go on forever. It has to be getting its energy from somewhere, and so you begin to understand that matter itself, in effect, is almost like a perpetual motion machine. It is constantly in motion, and yet the energy has to be coming from somewhere. Otherwise, it would be violating, I think it's the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy.
Well,
and it's not.
The other part of this is, there are tie-ins all over the place. In fact, I did a story called Einstein's Anti-Gravity a couple of months ago, and in some ways I was feeling like when I completed that story, I thought, maybe this is the end of the road. This unified field theory stuff, maybe this is it. And I think that that's definitely a part of it, but I think that there's a larger picture at work here. And I'd have to say that the support for the mercury gas plasma, in terms of interactions with gravity, it sees support from Ponklonov's work with type 2 superconductors, as well as a lot of the stuff being published at STAFE. And one of the reasons is that they can trap magnetic field lines, which is kind of a macro-scale quantum effect. And that's something that plasmas happen to also be able to do. In fact, as I recall, those are the only two substances that can do that, with the exception of Bose-Einstein condensates, if you can make them. Additionally, I just heard a rumor last week about a fellow named Joachim Hauser, who was reporting that Heim theory, which was apparently research done in Germany after World War II, it provides yet another avenue of supporting evidence. And apparently there have been some research that's panned out from that in Germany after the war. So I was incredibly surprised to literally arrive on your doorstep last week and have you begin telling me what I was hearing from so many other sources.
Well, there's so many different individuals with overlapping areas of research. It's really kind of a shame that there isn't some kind of a conference for inventors and inquisitive people like myself, where we could sit down and just say, well, I have 10 pieces of the puzzle, and you fellows may have cumulatively another 200 pieces. If we all throw them into the same pot, maybe we can actually create a picture that tells us something. I don't claim to be an expert in all areas. I've been fortunate enough that I've had an ongoing correspondence with Tom Bearden, for example, for the better part of 25 years. I've been corresponding with Hal Puthoff for about 15, and more recently Tom Ballone for about the past 7 or so. All wonderful people, brilliant each in their own particular area. Hal Puthoff is a particularly brilliant mathematician, sort of an expert in stochastic electrodynamics. and it's always fascinating to get different viewpoints on the same subject matter. Getting back to the business of what makes the system go, what allows it to achieve these, unreal and remarkable performance capabilities. You have to understand that if you can find a way to reduce the effect of mass, if you find a way that you can nullify or reduce the effect of mass, then of course inertia goes right out the window with that loss of mass. And so it occurred to me that if in the case of hydrogen you have very low mass, very low interaction with the quantum zero point fluctuations in the vacuum, by virtue of the fact that there's just a lower number of particles involved, versus uranium, which has a very high rate of interaction because it's got a much larger number of particles, then it occurs to me that we're talking about an interaction with something in the environment. So the next question becomes, if you're working with something that's present in the environment and you can find a way to block that interaction, then perhaps you can cause some variability in this effect called mass. Now, Einstein himself was the one who said that nothing, having mass could travel faster than the speed of light. It's not been very well explained, at least in the college text and in high school text, physics text, about what actually causes the increase in mass when something accelerates, some material body accelerates through space-time. But everybody accepted the fact that as you accelerate through space-time, your mass increases. And when you decelerate, that additional accumulated effect of mass bleeds off and it returns back to its so-called steady state. So it occurred to me that as you're moving through the environment, what Einstein was saying is your rate of interaction with something in the environment is increasing. And that is really kind of the key to these higher performance levels, is you find a way to either draw that energy, whatever it is, present in the environment. You find a way to draw that energy out of the environment and use it for creating propulsive force, and you accomplish two things. You, number one, reduce the rate at which the mass of your vehicle increases, or you may be able to block it entirely. And at the same time, you're conserving energy by using that energy that you're blocking and redirecting, so to speak, into propulsive force. You're conserving energy by making it do work.
Absolutely.
So literally, the faster you travel, the more energy that is available, and the faster you're able to accelerate still by virtue of the fact that you continue to block this interaction of the zero-point energy with the atomic structure of you and your vehicle. And in so doing, allow this continued acceleration without an increase in mass.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit of breaking news here, and this is just the beginning steps of this technology, but I received word last night that Gravity Control Technologies in Hungary was able to create a 15% reduction in weight in a 100-gram test sample of mercury using a variation on these techniques. And I thought this would dovetail right into the interview because you're talking about these effects on a large scale, and they're apparently, at least purporting to see results on a very small scale. Any thoughts or comments for them as they continue testing?
Well, actually, I've moved several times since I think that same group had applied to the X Prize organization about 1.5 years, 2 years ago to participate in the same thing that Burt Rutan and crew ultimately wound up winning with Spaceship One. And they were rejected outright from what I had read because they were employing an entirely different and unorthodox technology to try and get off the ground, namely a kind of anti-gravity propulsion system. But they were suggesting, at least in what I read in the article, that they thought there was some way that they could employ some of the new low-temperature, or I should say high-temperature superconducting materials like this yttrium barium copper oxide component ceramic compound that was developed by Dow Chemical as a way of somehow nullifying gravity. And that by creating these superconductors and spinning them in a certain way, that they would be able to maybe have some usable effects, something like what I think Podkletnov was trying to do in his experiments. I managed to track down an email address for these folks, and I I sent them an email a while back, and they never did respond to it. But what I said to them was, if you find a way to nullify or to block this interaction between the zero-point energy and the material elements of your craft, you're going to be creating high-temperature superconductors anyway, because the electrons moving through your circuitry are going to be mass-reduced or mass-nullified also. And that by itself, without any cryogenic fluids whatsoever, will create the same kind of superconducting qualities that you want in the circuitry of your craft.
Well, that's actually a perfect tie-in to my next question, because there are actually two different systems that have been described. One of them is the very baseline traditional mercury gas plasma, which is actually similar to stuff used in light bulbs in many ways. You know, they have the mercury vapor lights, which literally just run high voltage through a tube, quartz tube filled with mercury vapor. Now, the other type, the type that Edgar Fouché and I believe yourself are describing, is actually a virtual plasma, and it's doped with thorium and beryllium peroxide. And I was talking to a physicist from Japan this morning, Dr. William Riken, and I was describing these compounds to him and describing the notes for the interview. And the thing he said right off the top of his head, he said, that sounds like they're making a superconductor. And he started looking up mercury thorium superconductors. So this technique uses very high pressures, though, doesn't it? 250,000 atmospheres?
Well, I think when you talk about an atmosphere, you're talking about a single unit representing about 14.5 or 14.7 pounds per square inch times 250,000. So that sounds to me, personally, I believe that's way too high, just an opinion, of course. But I did see a videotape some time ago about Ed Fouché making reference to a classified aircraft that he either saw or worked on out at Area 51 that was referred to as the TR-3B, I think it was. And it was purported to have electrogravitic propulsion, and that it used a kind of mercury turbine. Sounds an awful lot like the stories of the old Vimanas using mercury engines from the ancient Sumerian texts. Also noteworthy in all of this is the high incidence of UFO sightings in San Jose, California in the 30s and 40s, which just happens to have one of the largest mercury mines in the United States. That's why the San Jose Mercury News has the name that it does, because of the mercury mine that's there.
Interesting.
But the point being that if you have an element like mercury, which, by the way, sits practically right next to the element gold on the periodic table, and you put it into an extreme environment where it's under a lot of pressure, it's doped with thorium, which is mildly radioactive, and according to one individual I spoke to, has a very high potential for, I think what he said was lowering the threshold of emission. If it's going to, be emitting radiation, or if a solution with mercury in it has thorium in there, and it's going to be giving off ions and radiations associated with high voltage ions and things like that, that this would reduce the threshold of emission. Now, one individual I talked to had mentioned the adding of another compound called beryllium peroxide. It was described when being used in that particular context as acting as a kind of wetting agent, especially if you're flashing tremendously high voltages through the mercury. Now, in the case of Ed Fouché's discussion and what he described, he was describing a device that looks somewhat like a very large hockey puck, sort of a low, flat cylinder, approximately its height being approximately 1/2 its overall diameter, and that it spun at a very high speed, and its internal contents were under extreme pressure. Now, I don't know whether that's true. I do know that the TR-3A was a conventionally powered aircraft that they're in operation, have been in operation since at least 1992. and were built at least partially by McDonnell Douglas, and possibly even by Boeing, and were seen being flown out of the McDonnell Douglas production facility near, I think it's Long Beach, California, in the early 1990s. I know someone who personally saw them. And it was a strictly conventionally powered sort of wing and body type aircraft, like a flying Dorito with a couple of short stubby tails that canted inward.
Sure.
But the TR-3B, I don't know whether that might be a legitimate vehicle or not, but the aspect of using mercury in the propulsion system, I think that the idea is that you want to do things, create an environment that would allow the mercury to either give off a powerful electromagnetic field in the same way that you might expect to find it if it was in gaseous form. Now, you probably know this already, but if you take liquid mercury and you heat it, and of course it sublimates, it turns to vapor, a very dangerous heavy metal vapor, very dangerous to work around. If you fire high voltage electricity through it in an open air environment, it also has a tendency to do the same thing, which can also be really dangerous. But if you put it under high pressure and you put it into a container, a vessel that runs right down through the center of a toroidal or donut-shaped electromagnetic field, with the field lines stroking vertically through the center of that toroidal field, you can shape the kinds of things that happen in the mercury as the electricity is being fired through it. And as far as my research is concerned, what this does in essence is it creates all of the beneficial effects of a plasma, like the modeled after, say, a toroidal plasma ball, like ball lightning, but it does it in a contained high-pressure environment that prevents it from going into its extremely high-temperature gaseous form or plasma form, which of course can be quite destructive to the components in your system. So this is where the idea of a virtual plasma comes from. You create highly energized ions, possibly that are being subjected to high frequency or microwave radiation from the operation of your Tesla coil. And in so doing, you also create a secondary and very powerful electromagnetic field in the core of this device that you can then use as a secondary source of power. Now, one of the physicists that I talked to said that there's a lot of speculation in the physics community right now that the virtual plasma is in fact the vehicle through which the zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum can be tapped, sort of like opening up a doorway. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Well, we're almost out of time for today, but I'd like to wrap up by talking just a bit about money. Now, you've spent 15 years putting together designs based on your colleagues' testimony, as well as tons and tons of research and collaboration with some top scientists in how to put these breakthrough propulsion ideas together. Now, the result of this is a proprietary design for the technology that you're positive has a chance to work, given the resources to actually put it together and build it. How much do you think it will cost to build, and how can funders get in touch with you?
Well, that's a matter of speculation. I mean, I sat down one day and tried to calculate out if I created each of the plate capacitors, for a 24-foot diameter vehicle that supported 4 people, passengers, pilot. We're talking tons of copper, if it was just copper. And as it turns out, it's a much more sophisticated lamination of magnesium, zinc, and bismuth, and there's some fabrication processes that are pretty spendy. 25 pounds of the stuff would cost about $250, and we're talking a requirement of perhaps tons to make this thing function in the way that it should. If the plates themselves were just made out of solid copper, half an inch thick, and you had something like 161 plates of copper, you're probably talking $250,000 just for materials alone. And that's not even getting into the rather exotic materials for the clear dielectric material in between, which is a type of quartz, and the fabrication and the facilities to do that. So if I was going to hot rod this thing and I was going to first prove that it would work, I would probably need somewhere between $150,000 $250,000 just to build a little tiny demonstration model, something 3-4 feet in diameter. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in funding this kind of thing. I note that the second phase of the X Prize is now $20 million for a single orbit of the Earth within 2 weeks' time. And a system like this, even a really small one that could accommodate 4 people, say something 8 to 12 feet in diameter, could probably accomplish an orbit of the Earth probably a dozen or more times in a single day once it's operational. So it'd be really fun to kind of take all that conventional propulsion technology and throw it out the window in one fell swoop with a demonstration like that, but it remains to be seen.
Well, thanks again, Mark. And
welcome. I appreciate the time, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for explaining this to us.
You're welcome.
If you have further questions or comments about Mark's work, you can reach Mark at markmccandlish@czone.net. That's spelled MarkMcCandlish at c-zone.net.